All right, so this should be our last video on World War II. And again, um, I've compressed it so much, it's so hard, but hopefully you're getting something out of it and getting a good general understanding and wanting to go and learn more about it. So let's pull up the map of the Pacific. All right, so again, the thing about the war in Europe, the World War II for the United States, is the fact that we are fighting this war on completely opposite sides of the world, right? We've got troops that are in Europe, and we're fighting and sending supplies and all of those things to Europe and paying attention to everything going on in Europe. And then we're also fighting in the Pacific, this huge life and death battle in the Pacific. And think about what this is doing for people who are running this, right? Franklin Roosevelt, and the fact that he's getting briefings on the national economy and the manufacturing and all of those things on the home front that is going on. You've got a lot of racial problems going on in the United States, where you've got, the Japanese Americans are interned. You have a series of race riots against African Americans in different cities with housing issues and things like this. Just all these things on the home front. And then you've got the war in Europe, and he's got to make all those decisions and pay attention to that. And then this war in the Pacific. And it's just so much. Uh, the good news is he had a lot of good help. He had a lot of very smart people. Franklin Roosevelt surrounded himself with very smart people. General George Marshall was the head of the American military in World War II, and he was in charge of both the war in Europe and the war in the Pacific. And then you break it down where you've got generals and admirals and people in the Navy and that are controlling both sides of the war. And again, those are more details you can read about, but I just always think it's really important when you're thinking about the war that you realize all those things that are going on again at the same time, and those realities for the people who lived at that time, to keep it all straight. Uh, so the war in the Pacific, I think this is a really important part of the American war story. It often gets, when we used to read newspapers, we'd say page two, right? You get the front page would be the news in Europe, and page two would be the war in the Pacific. And even though we were bombed at Pearl Harbor, and that kind of inspired us to get involved in the war, the decision had been made early on, even before we were in the war, that we would prioritize the conflict in Europe. Now, part of that, there's lots of reasons for that, but I won't go into that. So the war in the Pacific, again, remember, this is a war of empires. So what is going on in Europe really does influence what goes on here. We've got Japan, and you can see Japan is not huge. It is an island nation, a series of islands, really. Much of it is mountainous terrain. And they want to industrialize. They want to spread their power and their strength, just as other countries in the world had. But they are doing it very violently. And they are taking it from European powers. Again, just as a reminder, when they attacked Pearl Harbor, they also attacked places like Hong Kong, which was controlled by the British. They attacked the Philippines, which was controlled by the United States. They attacked the Dutch East Indies. They attacked Guam. They had already worked to take control of French Indochina, which we call Vietnam today. But when France lost, they lost control of French Indochina. So much of that European control of the Pacific that we had talked about when we talked about those empires early on in the semester, now they are all suffering, because many of these spaces in the Pacific were providing needed goods. Remember too, so this map shows Burma. India is just off this map. Well, India is controlled by Great Britain, and so supplying a lot of goods to Great Britain. China is this great nation that is struggling within itself. Were on the verge of civil war before the war started. As the war goes on, the two sides come together, but as soon as World War II is over, China is going to collapse into a civil war. Just a real disaster in the making there. So the Pacific is a hot mess, right? It's just a mess, and Japan is going to take great advantage of it. So as you can see from the key down here, this red line here shows the extent of the Japanese control. Very quickly, they call it the Iron Perimeter, right, where they're able to spread and take all of this territory. You see how very close they got to taking us, to getting Australia. There were invasions of Australia planned. They did take some of the Aleutian Islands, right? This is the Aleutian Island chain off of Alaska. And so you have American troops that are out here on the Aleutians, and there are battles here on Attu and Kiska. And the Japanese were there for some time, but then they did leave. They weren't there for a terribly long time. So this is pretty extensive, and they do all of this before the United States really gets much into the fight here in the Pacific. We're recovering after Pearl Harbor, and have to recover from a number of these other battles. We're again spooling up. We're recruiting men, drafting men, training men, building ships. All of these things have to occur before we can go to defeat Japan. There are a few major battles in the Pacific. I just want to very briefly, very quickly make sure you know about. This one here is the Battle of Midway. So we've got Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The Japanese realized they need to come back and really finish the job that they had started here. They have some conflicts down here in the Battle of Guadalcanal in August of 42 to February 43, this huge battle. Here's a big battle of Coral Sea where we're able to stop the Japanese. Their goal was to defeat and take control of the islands in the Coral Sea here, and then be able to come down south and invade Japan, where all of the allies were basing. So that was the goal. The American Navy was able to hold them off here. It wasn't a victory for the Americans for sure, but it wasn't a victory for the Japanese either. It was kind of a draw, and it drew that line where the Japanese they never got past it. Okay, so that was in May of 1942, one of our first real battles in the Pacific. And then in June of 1942, the Japanese tried to take this Midway Island, which is a very small island. It's just a spit in the ocean there, but it had an airfield, right? It had a runway and enough room to have some oil and fuel and that type of thing. Again, very small island. But the Japanese wanted to take it. And of course, if they had taken it, they would be able to launch more attacks on Pearl Harbor. They would be able to spy and see every time the American Navy moved out of Pearl Harbor. It was just a very important place for them to take, and a very important place for the Americans to hold. It is a huge battle. A number of men sacrifice their lives. Hundreds of pilots are killed. This is an aerial warfare from their aircraft carriers and our aircraft carriers in this huge conflict. In the end, the luck, the gods of war were shining on Americans, whatever, and we stumbled upon their aircraft carriers, or some of our planes did, and we were able to sink 3 of them, mortally wounding them in the way of aircraft carriers for the rest of the war. Because while the United States was building more and more ships, more and more planes, more and more of everything, the Germans and the Japanese were very limited in their ability to replace things. So while they were both ahead of us at the beginning of the war, they just weren't able to keep up. So the United States is able to hold Midway Island. That's why you see the line is drawn here. We're able to hold Midway Island. And again, there's a great old film called Midway. I think there's a new version of it as well, which I haven't seen yet, but the original one was done in the 1960s. And it really is a heroic battle. I don't talk much about heroes or anything like that. But these men took real risks, and many of them died and made real sacrifices to try to hold this island. So Midway is a very important battle. Coral Sea is important. Midway is important. And then there are others in here. You see the Philippines here. The Japanese are able to take the Philippines very early in December of 1941. You've heard of the Battle of Bataan. Your textbook talks about it, where the Americans, kind of holed up and tried to hold on to the Philippines until they were practically starved to death, and then marched to their deaths at Bataan. There's a group of American nurses who are captured along with the Americans who are captured by the Japanese there and end up serving the whole war as POWs. So a lot of very moving stories of conflict there in the Philippines. The Japanese needed to hold the Philippines because they wanted to attack to the south. The Americans needed it back so they could attack to the north. Your textbook talks about this briefly, and I want to show you with some of these images that the United States has this policy of island hopping, where we fight from island to island. And there's a whole series of them with this idea of the United States is going to have to get closer and closer to Japan. If we're going to invade Japan and tighten that noose around Japan, just like we had tightened the noose around Germany, we've got to get closer. So there's fighting in China, that the Chinese are doing, and the United States is supplying China with supplies, with planes, with tanks, with trucks, with guns, with food, all of these things. But then the United States and the British are fighting here in Burma, the Australians are fighting here in Burma and India and all of this, right? There are so many nations that are fighting in this area. But the Americans are fighting for the sea, right? We're fighting this island hopping campaign to get closer and closer to Japan, because this map is really deceptive. These are thousands of miles that we're talking about, which means you can't just go and bomb Japan until you get close enough to be able to launch planes that can fly long distances. And it's really these struggles that it's not until the spring of 1945 that the United States has gotten close enough to be able to launch bombing attacks on Japan. And it's in March of 1945 that we're bombing Tokyo. We use our B-29s, which are those giant 4-engine planes that fly at higher altitudes and longer distances. And they bombed Tokyo in the spring of 1945. I think it's important to know about Tokyo and the bombing of Tokyo in the spring of 1945. One of the attacks on the city, they use fire bombs. They're called incendiary bombs because they cause fires. In one of these raids, it's over a 3-day period in March of 1945, something like 80 to 100,000 people are killed in the city of Tokyo by fire. The city burns very quickly, and they're caught up in these firestorms. And those are estimates on the numbers, maybe a little low. And they use these incendiary rays across Japan. Of course, it's very easy to get caught up in the apologists for the war, and especially the things that are to come. We have this great battle at Okinawa. We have this and Iwo Jima is February 1945. Okinawa is April of 1945. Hundreds of thousands of lives are lost over the course of this conflict. And then of course we're developing the atomic bombs. Um, the Japanese were brutal in this war, and again, this isn't a war about Japan or a war or a class about Japan or the world at war, but do yourself a favor and look up the city of Nanking in World War II. It's sometimes called Nanjing. And the story of the rape of Nanjing or Nanking. The Japanese went in and killed hundreds of thousands of people, and much of the violence and death was through rape. Um, Read more about it. But the Japanese were brutal. And the fighting that they did on these islands across the Pacific was brutal. Suicide raids were brutal. You know, strapping grenades to themselves and surrendering and then exploding them so they could kill as many American soldiers as they could along the way. It was brutal. The Japanese were not surrendering. They were not giving in as we got closer and closer. The United States had been developing these atomic weapons, which were horrific weapons. The Germans had been building them as well, but were stopped. And on August 6th, 1945, the United States dropped the first atomic weapon in the world on the city of Hiroshima in Japan. Completely wiped the city out, flattened it to the ground. Nothing remained within a certain radius. Something like 60 to 80,000 people were killed, many instantly. 2 days later, on August 8th, 1945, the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan. They wanted some of the spoils of war. They knew the war was ending. Japan still did not surrender. And on August 9th, 1945, the United States dropped the second atomic weapon ever used in the world on Nagasaki, Japan. Again, killing huge numbers of people almost instantly. Japan then surrendered. This use of the atomic weapons is controversial to this day. The United States holds the horrific reality of being the only country to have used atomic weapons in war. Would the war have ended without it? We were planning on an invasion. We didn't know if the weapons would work. And the estimates for the dead were about 500,000 American dead and about 1 million Japanese dead. So those who worked on this weapon, the men who dropped this weapon, who flew the planes, who dropped this weapon, believe that they saved lives. They saved hundreds of thousands of American lives, and they saved 1 million Japanese lives. It's impossible to know what would have happened. It's impossible to know if Japan would have surrendered without it. I think as a historian, I think the first bomb was more justifiable than the second. I struggle a bit more with the bombing of Nagasaki. But in the end, the whole war was horrific. Millions of people are killed throughout the world. I think the further we get from this, we're now 75 plus years from the end of World War II. And the further we get from the end of this, the less people remember about how horrible war is. It's not just the cute things that you see in the movies of the boyfriend going off to war and not coming home, or coming home and, oh, hooray, hooray. Millions of people starved to death in World War II. Besides the violent deaths that we think of from gunfire and rape and pillaging and all of those things, millions of people just simply starved to death. Millions of people never found their families again. You've watched the film on the America and the Holocaust, and some of the responsibility the United States holds for not saving lives during the Holocaust. That film focuses on the Jewish lives lost in the Holocaust in Germany. Some 6 million Jews, but 6 million other people were killed in the Holocaust in Germany. So 12 million total. We know because the Germans kept meticulous records and didn't get them destroyed before the war ended. So, Jews were killed in Europe, but also homosexuals, political opponents, gypsies, mentally challenged people, physically challenged people, anybody. They were, 6 million others were killed. So this reality of war is unforgivable and something that we should fight against always, because it's just, there's nothing quite like it. And if we ended in another world war, I don't believe we would survive it, because nuclear weapons are everywhere now. That was the lesson of, all the films from the 1980s, right? The dystopian films, even the silly one, War Games, which is a fun, dumb, dumb movie from the 1980s. So this tragedy that was World War II, we should always remember it. I hope that you will go and learn more about it and really learn the depth of it, because it really is, the United States comes out of it as this great hero, and we'll talk about this in the next module, but it really is one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century. And I hope you learned a little bit about it, and I hope that you will be interested enough to go and learn more. All right, I'll stop there. Thank you all.